firmly now, having perhaps been almost neglected until fairly recently. Obviously, people have very different perspectives on this referendum as to whether it's how to minimise the chance of a no vote, or whether it maximise the chance of a no vote, or whether to try and work out what the consequences would be of a yes vote, which is obviously a fairly significant aspect. This is the first I see of two meetings. This one is on the legal and I suppose security side, foreign and security policy, and we've got a very good bunch of speakers. You have their CVs in the piece of paper in front of you. First one is Sir Richard Ottaway. Now, Richard has to leave at 2:45. So if you divide an hour by 4, you get about, actually, because I'm the chairman, you get, that comes to 13 or 12 or 13 minutes. So a quick burst from each speaker, but and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. But because Richard's got to leave, we'll have Richard's presentation, and then he'd agreed to take a few questions. If we'd all get too difficult, he might leave even earlier. But we'll take a few questions for Richard immediately after his speech.
Thank you very much, Trevor, and thank you very much to the LCSS for inviting me. I do apologise for having to go. It's a very heavy vote on the immigration bill any time after 3:15 this afternoon, which is why I have to go back. I'm going to speak primarily to a report that the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which I chair in the House, published about a year ago on foreign policy implications of Scottish separation. And what we're talking about today is an independent Scotland. And I want to give you a quote from Alex Salmond, so you just have some idea of how he sees it. He says, Scotland must choose if it wants to continue as an economic region of the unbalanced, unequal Westminster model, or take on the paths of a national economy in an independent Scotland. That's a country, according to the SNP, would be one of the wealthiest nations in the world, with a better welfare system, more equal taxes, and healthier public finances. It's going to be free from the rule of a coalition government that it doesn't support, a country that will engage fully with the international community. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the SNP sees the future of independent Scotland. And I believe that that is a mistaken analysis. Now, the yes vote has been gaining ground, and the gap between the yes and no camps is currently too close to call, and the don't knows or the undecided may yet tip the balance. But in my opinion, the yes campaign arguments are exaggerated, and they are tending to play on people's emotions, which is a phenomenon which you see from other political parties, but it doesn't tend to last for very long. But these arguments currently seem to be very powerful, but they are dangerous and they don't match the reality. To me, the benefit in terms of prosperity, security, and international influence leave no doubt in my mind that Scotland will be better remaining inside the United Kingdom. So let's have a look at the facts. Turning to the most obvious one from a foreign policy concept, that is international influence. Today, Scotland, as a part of the United Kingdom, is represented in the world's most important institutions. They are part of, they support a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, membership of the European Union, NATO, G8, or is it the G7? In that way, it holds a significant sway on the world stage and wields power to influence global matters. And you have to have a look at where Scotland would be if it pulls out of the Union. Scotland would, in effect, start afresh and negotiate its membership with many international organisations. It's worth actually having a quick look at the number of international treaties that the United Kingdom is a party to. It is 18,000, and that is the number that a larger percentage of those would actually have to be renegotiation. But Scotland will have to start renegotiating its membership of the key institutions, but not just the ones I've mentioned, but other institutions that, like the Council of Europe, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, just to name a few. And Scotland, as a small country inside these organisations, will be very dependent on large countries to push their interests. But most importantly, it will still be dependent upon the United Kingdom's willingness to cooperate in both internal and external issues. Let's have a look at the European Union. Interestingly, in his recent speech, Alex Salmond said that he believed the biggest threat to Scottish membership of the European Union is not the independence vote, but the possible 2017 in-out referendum pledged by David Cameron and the Conservative Party if they win the next election. But David Cameron's goal is not to exit the European Union, but to reform it and to improve the conditions of our membership. Whereas if Scotland leaves the UK, its place in the EU would be called into question. The Scottish Government is, after a lot of prevarication, is finally beginning to recognise that the EU membership won't be straightforward and will have to be negotiated. That opinion is not just the view of the UK Government, it is the view of the President of the Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, and it was repeated in writing by the Commissioner for Justice, Fundamental Rights and Citizenship, Viviane Reding. So, although Scotland already applies the acquis communautaire, which is the law and regulations, it is very unlikely that the accession talks will be finalised by March 2016, which is the date of independence. Notwithstanding what on earth would happen to the UK in that intervening period as well. But on the contrary, there was a great chance that the talks wouldn't even get going. The entry to the EU requires the green light from all EU member states. And I can point out, as I'm sure you can all anticipate, one potential opponent to Scotland's membership of the European Union, that is Spain, who are facing a very serious independent challenge from Catalonia. And we've all noticed the increased number of Catalonian MPs beginning to take an interest in this referendum. So for Scotland, leaving the UK might result in more than a temporary exit from the European Union. But what that would actually mean for Scotland, it will mean that their access to the single market of 500 million people will actually have to be negotiated on a temporary or interim basis. And I'm sure the terms will not be as favourable as they have at the moment, and they will suffer from the move. In 2011, Scots exports without gas and oil amounted to 69.4 billion, out of which the rest of the UK was estimated at 45.5 billion. That is a lot of trade. And until Scotland reaccessed the EU or negotiated a trade deal, access to the single market will be at risk, and they face the threat of customs duties. This would also apply to Scottish trade, in theory, with the rest of the United Kingdom, which would remain in the EU. Now, so that's the single market point. If Scotland re-enters the EU, it will probably lose all the advantages negotiated by the British governments. That's the rebate from the budget, which is worth about £3 billion a year, the opt-out from the monetary union, and the justice and citizenship chapter, as well as from the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And like all other member states, Scotland would have to commit to joining the Eurozone and the Schengen area, which is the key political point which they are trying to avoid addressing by maintaining the, I believe, fallacious argument that they will retain their membership. And this would clash with the SNP's vow to keep the British pound and to be a part of the UK common travel area. So Scotland would have to negotiate its contributions to the EU budget, which would mean paying more and receiving less, especially from the EU structural funds. And finally, of course, as a small country, they would lose much of the influence that they benefit from as a member of the UK. So that's the EU. Turning to the United Nations and NATO, the UN will be fairly straightforward, as there is a fast-track procedure and it can be done on a majority vote. But NATO membership will be a distinctly tougher nut to crack. Although the SNP has made it clear that they want Scotland to be a part of NATO, its pledge to be a non-nuclear country will almost certainly make it more difficult. Now, the SNP have promised to get rid of Trident in the speediest, safe way possible. And that is going to cause not only a problem for the United Kingdom, but for NATO as a whole, as a leading player in NATO and one of a very small number of countries with a nuclear deterrent. And any UK disarmament resulting from Scottish independence would be received badly by the UK's key allies. It would certainly impact upon their enthusiasm to approve Scotland's entry to NATO and most probably to the European Union as well. And moreover, it could even influence its United Nations bid. They will look at them saying the nuclear deterrent is important and this country is trying to diminish it, and yet it still wants to have its membership. In short, they want their cake and to eat it. So all the issues, local and international, that will depend on the UK's willingness to cooperate will be compromised. And a well-negotiated deal on the UK's nuclear deterrent would be urgently needed, but currently they're showing on this issue total inflexibility. Turning to diplomacy and security, an independent Scotland will need its own diplomatic service. No longer be able to benefit from the British diplomatic network, which is one of the most accomplished in the world. And it brings not just diplomatic access or benefit of the trade support that they get for such emblematic Scottish products as Scottish whisky. Today, Scotland has overseas representation offices in 13 countries. And to match the quality of the business and consular support provided by the Foreign Office and UKTI, it will need 270 diplomatic posts and in 170 countries, which is the present coverage of the Foreign Office. This will cost a lot of money and it will need a lot of people. In all honesty, I think they're more likely to opt for the Benelux model, which is representation in about 70 countries. But even then, that is not cheap and still will need a lot of people. And the same applies to defence. Scotland is going to need both internal and external security and intelligence capability to protect its people. Currently, obviously, it has no intelligence service at all. And so far, they've pledged £2.5 billion for defence and security, and I do question as to whether or not that figure is adequate for their ambitions. It's probably enough to set up a professional army, but it's certainly not enough to include threats from cybercrime, organised crime, international terrorism, or failed states. And there seems to be a belief in the Scottish Government, which I detected when I was in Edinburgh, that this shortfall might be filled by the United Kingdom. Although in many cases it would be in the UK's interest to help Scotland, Scotland must be aware that such support would not be automatic and it would have to be negotiated. They may well become a client of GCHQ and security services, but it will cost money. They will have to contribute. And at the same time, it's clear that the UK and Scottish foreign policies, as well as defence and intelligence, will converge. So I just pose the question, what is the point of spending money and time to replicate something that's already in existence? Can I conclude, Trevor, with the consequences for the rest of the United Kingdom? I think a yes vote will be pretty seismic, in all honesty, for Britain and for the British people and for the United Kingdom. And it's going to have far-reaching consequences for the UK. The UK will retain its membership of the international organisations. It'll still be the 8th largest economy, but we would lose part of our territory, population and economy. We would also suffer reputational damage and our hard and soft power would diminish. There are even suggestions and rumours and claims that some developing countries like India, Brazil or South Africa would try to deprive us from our permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Fortunately, this seat is guaranteed by treaty, and of course there is a precedent in the breakup of the Soviet Union. Russia retained its permanent seat on the Security Council, as they lost a lot more than the Soviet Union than we would lose if Scotland was to break away. But our loss of influence would have a negative impact on the government's plans to reform the European Union, not to mention the fact that we have the obvious possibility of a Schengen-type border between Scotland and Britain. And one of the biggest challenges to our own security would be the future of the nuclear issue. I'm sure there's others around the table more expert than me as to what the options are. But if we have to pull the nuclear arsenal out of the Clyde, the estimated cost would be in the region of £10 billion, present huge logistical, planning and political costs. So the choice of the new location and the construction of new facilities would have to involve a controversial movement of local residents and would be far from straightforward. And the way that this potential challenge would be handled by independent Scottish authorities would also define the UK's future relationship with the new country. Therefore, in my judgment, staying together is a complete no-brainer. The facts and not the emotions point to this conclusion. And I hope that on the 18th of September, the Union will win. But at the same time, I recognise that whatever the result is going to be, both the governments, the UK and the Scottish one, will have to analyse the fallout in detail and reflect on the next steps to take. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Admirably. Now, we're going to have some other speakers out with a clear statement from a political position.
Sure.
And so I think if we just take 5 or 6 minutes for questions, if people have got questions. Sorry, could people identify themselves?
My name's Al Bennett. I'm a former diplomat, and I'm now, among other things, Vice Chairman of Migration Watch UK. You touched on a couple of things that I'd like to take up, but one in particular, Schengen, right at the end there.
Yeah.
If Scotland were to secede and was forced into the Schengen arrangement, that would require them, because of Schengen rules, to have some sort of border control between them and any non-Schengen country, i.e. England and Ireland. If, in fact, they wanted to remain within the common travel area, then that would mean having some sort of immigration system which is in line with the rest of the United Kingdom. At the moment, from what they say, they in fact are going to have a very different policy, because they're going to want to attract rather more people, migrants, than our present system would allow for. How would you square that particular circle, Sir Richard?
I'm not quite sure that I see the circle that's going to be squared. I mean, the common, as I said in my remarks, the common travel area, they obviously want to remain part of it. But if they're in the Schengen area and we're not, then the common travel area will not include Scotland. I mean, perfectly straightforward. And as you know, Schengen is an obligation for all new members of the EU, and this is, as I said, this is why they're fairly reluctant not to get too involved in this debate, because it's a very, very awkward one. But it's not their obligation to put up the border; it's going to be ours.
Well, not necessarily. If Schengen rules require that Schengen members have some sort of control with non-Schengen members, and my point really is that this is going to be a serious problem which hasn't really been addressed yet. It's been glossed over. Is it something that we should be talking more about than we have been?
The general view of Westminster, and as Trevor said, I've given you a political dimension here, is we're far more likely to persuade the Scots to vote no if we are positive, if we are glass half full, if you talk about the benefits of union, rather than dwell on the disadvantages of separation. And that is really why we've not spent too much time on it. We're forever talking about the strength of being together rather than the disadvantages of not. But I didn't duck it in my remarks.
No, I'm not suggesting you did. I'm talking about more general
yeah.
debate.
Yeah.
So, fine, thank you.
Vernon Bolton on King's College. I mean, this is about the disadvantage again. I mean, an independent Scotland would have to offer English students free university education, would it not? Would it also have to offer, no, it's a serious point, would it also not have to offer English elderly people free care? I mean, would there not be a great extra expense for the Scottish Government, which some have to meet, because it would have to offer England benefits, which it now doesn't offer?
Yeah, you go right to the heart of it. I find it quite bizarre at the moment that you get a Lithuanian and Scotland, a Brit city in St Andrews, and the only one paying is the
that's subsidy out.
Is the Brit. And yeah, I mean, in theory, that is the obvious consequence. I mean, I took the Foreign Affairs Committee promoted a report to Edinburgh, and Alex Salmon's deputy, forget her name.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Nicola Sturgeon appeared in front of us. And the answer to every tough question was, well, this is something we can negotiate. You know, in between a yes vote and the 16th of March. And I mean, unbelievable trying to negotiate it. And indeed, the interesting question is, what on earth do we do in Britain if there's a yes vote? It's going to be, 7 months before a general election, when you have the possibility that 10 months into the next Parliament, 50 of the MPs will be disenfranchised. Do we postpone the election for 10 months?
Or bring it forward.
Or bring it forward. Well, that's an interesting thought, yeah.
Could I ask you, I mean, I think in some ways the Prime Minister agreed to the wrong question. Because the question is, should Scotland be a sovereign, an independent state? I think that's the expression. This is a group of international politics students, I think, sitting around the room. I mean, I think the question should have been, should Scotland be a sovereign state? Because many of the issues that you point to are those that sovereign states know they have to address. If you ask someone do they want to be independent, the opposite of independence in people's minds is often dependence. And why wouldn't you want to be independent? Because it's nicer.
I think the question was finally agreed by the Electoral Commission, wasn't it?
Was it?
I think the original proposal was more along your lines, and I think the Electoral Commission said no, a perfectly neutral question is the one we've got. And rather than have a row with the Electoral Commission, I think we accepted it, and that's what's enshrined in the statute.
Well,
Yeah. But I think
I understood a bit further, I think. Sorry.
My name is Latif Tash, I'm from SOAS. I have two short questions. The first question about oil and gas. If I'm not wrong, it's described a Queen estate. How is going to be shared, this gas, oil and gas between UK and Scotland? The second question, you mentioned about the possible EU referendum in 2017, the Conservative Party is going to win. And then you said that Cameron's goal is not exit from the Union, it's improve condition and current situation. Which area especially you are meaning that they try to improve and current condition?
If I know I was going to get that question, I would have bought David Cameron's article in the Telegraph a week ago when he set it out. I mean, he wants to see powers flowing back from Brussels. Do you mind if I just refer you to the article? I haven't come here with the shopping list of reforms. They are, the important thing about them is that only out of the 7, 6 of them don't require treaty change. And the final one, which is does require a treaty change, is the treaty commitment to ever closer union, which we want to opt out of. But he's not particularly not gone into great detail at the moment, because first of all he wants to win the general election and then start the negotiation. But he has set out half a dozen areas because this is a debate about Scotland and Born along with me. You asked the question about oil and gas. That is not, again, that's not been decided. It's in the Nicola Sturgeon business of can we resolve this afterwards. I actually think it makes sense to let them have the oil and gas in the territorial waters around Scotland. This is a financial leg up to them to help them get going. But if you share the assets, you've got to share the burdens as well, and they've got to be prepared to take on a percentage of the Britain's national debt. They can't expect to have no debt and the assets, because the debt, a lot of the debt is connected to the development of the assets. And so it's unresolved at the moment.
Perhaps we should give you a chance to listen to a few for 10 minutes. So the next speaker is Andrew Blake, which I think is on my left here. And Andrew, my clock's ticking, but please, obviously.
I'm going to talk about the perspective you get from constitutional history on all of this. I'm not continually going to address what will happen if Scotland becomes independent, but I'll be talking about some of the historic rationales for the United Kingdom as a state and what the referendum tells us about how they might have changed and how this helps understand what might happen if, depending on which way Scotland votes in a referendum. First of all, we've got to look at the rationale for why did the United Kingdom come into being as a state in the first place. It was partly a response to fear of France under Louis XIV attaining hegemony on the continental mainland, which drove England to bring about a union with Scotland in the first place in 1706, 1707. The idea was to create an integrated bloc of resistance to Louis XIV that would link up with other powers in Europe. And then about a century later, Great Britain and Ireland integrated for similar reasons, only this time it's France under Napoleon, which was the fear on France under Louis XIV. Inbuilt into the state that was created at this point was a large dose of religious discrimination, some of which is still found in our constitutional framework of our Christian country, as the Prime Minister has decided we are recently. Either way, obviously those rationales have now gone. We're not really worried about French hegemony, but we do have a fear of a kind of Eurozone hegemony and accelerating integration of the Eurozone, leaving us outside, but we don't want to join the Eurozone, but at the same time we're quite worried about the Eurozone doing things which are a bit beyond the control, which is one of the concerns that the Prime Minister David Cameron set out in his speech, his famous speech on Europe a couple of years ago, where he said there needs to be safeguards to stop the Eurozone accelerating too far without the other non-Eurozone countries having control over it. So we do have a kind of fear of a continental hegemony, but not the same kind of fear. So that basis for the UK as a state has gone, which you could say calls into question the kind of state that the UK is. Also, I think the rise of the European Union does change the rationale for being in the UK in other ways, because when Great Britain was set up, it was at the time became the largest single market in Europe, and like the EU of today, it not only removed internal tariffs and created a single currency, but it also sought to establish a single regulatory regime within that single market, removing what we would now call non-tariff barriers. And actually some of the early architects of the European Union in Italy and other places looked to the Union, the UK, as a model for a kind of a single market, what you could do with successful integration. Actually, they didn't do it in nearly as centralised way as we did in the UK, but that's another story. So now the EU is the largest single market in the world, not the UK. So the way to get access to the largest single market in the world comes via membership of the EU. And as we just heard from Sir Richard quite rightly, it's membership of the EU is a critical point of debate during the referendum campaign. It's been critical. I would argue that we do sometimes seem to encounter two different EUs in public discourse in the UK. The EU you hear about as a reason why Scotland shouldn't risk membership of the UK, and then another EU we hear about which is actually portrayed in a lot more negative terms, and membership is something we can risk in a referendum. I think there is a contradiction here that does need to be addressed in public discourse, but again, that's another issue. However, that's an important development, I think, in changing the rationale for why the UK exists as a state, which helps us to understand why we're in the position we are now. Linked to all of these shifting rationales was the collapse of the British Empire as well. A large part of the attraction of the Union from the Scottish point of view was that it offered the opportunities of what became the largest colonial construct in history. The Scots could share in some of the gains of that. Obviously, the collapse of the British Empire in the Second World War period removes all of those opportunities. And in fact, the collapse of the empire helped trigger a prolonged period of constitutional debate and change in the UK, which we're still going through now. And I think the Scottish referendum is another outgrowth of that debate. And if Scotland goes, it will be another part of that process. But if Scotland stays, the process will continue in another way. So what sort of state is the UK becoming? And I think this will apply whether or not Scotland goes or stays. In many ways, it's acquiring the characteristics of a federal constitution. In fact, when negotiations leading to the Union of 1706-1707 began, the opening position of the Scottish commissioners was that they wanted what they called a federal union. They wanted two separate parliaments with a single crown, single foreign policy, but two separate parliaments. That idea had a strong base of support in Scotland, but actually it wasn't very well thought through in the fine details, as has often been the case, in fact, with federal thought in the UK. The English were completely opposed to this idea, and they wanted what they called an incorporating union, and that's what they got. But perhaps the alternative version of the UK that Scotland wanted at the outset is now coming about. And I'd go so far as to say that the interesting discussion we heard about what would happen to Scotland if they became independent is that there might not be that much difference between an independent Scotland that ends up opting back into all these things in the UK and a Devo Max Scotland. The actual distinction between the two isn't enormous. One would be a kind of confederal model, one would be a federal model, but again, that's not something we can explore in massive detail. Since the 1990s, we are moving in the direction of a more federal constitution, in the sense that we've got devolution in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, though crucially not in England, outside Greenwich or London. And that the devolved level of government could be seen as equivalent to the state level of government in a federal constitution. The Human Rights Act could be seen as comparable with a Bill of Rights. And since 2009, we've had an independent UK Supreme Court functioning, that one of its responsibilities is adjudicating on disputes involving devolved powers. But if we are becoming a federal constitution, it will be an unusually laissez-faire one, in the sense that there now seems to be an established principle that if you can hold a referendum in a territory and get a yes vote for independence, you're allowed to leave. We've provided that for Northern Ireland in statute. We've provided that for Scotland in principle. I think it'd be very hard to deny now to Wales, or maybe even one day somewhere like Cornwall, who knows. But this principle certainly seems to be taking hold. And obviously there are certain barriers to, significant barriers to a fully federal UK, one of which is the size of England, which would be very hard to incorporate as a single unit into a stable model. And another barrier is we are still, particularly in England, very much attached to parliamentary sovereignty, or certainly a lot of people are, and you can't really reconcile parliamentary sovereignty with a written constitution and a fully federal state. Nevertheless, I think those tendencies are there, and I think those pressures will remain, whatever happens with the way Scotland votes. My final thought is on referendums in general. The referendum going on now brings home to us how important referendums have become in the UK. If you go back to the mid-70s, when there was debate in Parliament about whether there should be a referendum on the EEC in 1975, Labour government wanted to do it. The then leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher, was very concerned about the whole idea and said it's not really compatible with parliamentary sovereignty. She also said it's a move by an opportunistic Prime Minister to try and patch up his divided party. I don't know if that criticism could apply to any other Prime Minister at any other time in history. So we've got an issue with referendums becoming increasingly a part of decision making in the UK. And as the European issue shows, referendums don't necessarily settle a debate permanently. We had one in 1975, we got a big turnout, we got a big yes vote, but we're still here talking about another referendum. So I don't think we should be even convinced that this referendum will actually settle the constitutional issue in Scotland. And if the SNP and Scottish independence movement are serious about what they think, and I think they are serious about it, whether you agree with it's a different matter, but they are serious about it, I don't think they're just going to give up because of one referendum, and of course they only have to win once. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. A wider constitutional look. My colleague Malcolm Chalmers from Russia has an authentic accent, as you can tell. You will hear.
A little bit.
A little bit, yeah. So Malcolm, we'll pass to you before we take anything.
Whenever you see the name of a country with the word united at the beginning, it's a clue. And it's usually a clue to the fact that that country, historically at least, has not been united. The United States, the United Kingdom, the United Republic of Tanzania, the United Arab Emirates, you go through a list. United is a marker, and it's a marker, I think, for our country as well. And speaking personally, I'm a patriotic Scot as well as a patriotic Briton, and personally I'd prefer not to have to make that choice, but I am proud of the fact that our country's handling this issue, this very difficult issue, an issue that in many parts of the world has involved bloodshed and strife, as we're seeing in eastern Ukraine at this very moment. We are handling it in a very civilized and democratic and non-violent way, and there's absolutely no sign that we'll be handling it in any other way. And actually, in some ways, that reflects some of the values which Scots and other Britons share with each other. And one of the things what I want to say is that in the end, this choice in Scotland is not going to be primarily about costs and benefits and working out exactly whether the Schengen area will apply or not, or which the different parties will say different things, and the voters really won't know what the right answer is, and indeed we won't know what the right answer is until we try. In the end, it's going to be more about identity and whether people feel that emotional attachment, historical attachment to being British as well as being Scottish. And as somebody who at school, when I was taught history, the number of times we were taught about the Battle of Bannockburn, one of the few times when the Scots actually defeated the English, and how little we were taught about post-Union history. It's perhaps hardly surprising that nationalism is an important part of the Scottish identity. And it saddens me today also that what's happening in Scotland isn't an isolated phenomenon in Europe. It might be easier to handle if it was, but it's taking place in this country in parallel not only with the debate about EU membership, but also the remarkable rise of the UK Independence Party, which in many respects I think shares the parochial nationalism that the SNP has, but also many political groups throughout Europe have. And it's no accident, I think, that quite a number of the more nationalist parties across Europe are the parties which are expressing most sympathy, perhaps not support, but more sympathy for what President Putin is doing in Ukraine, because it speaks precisely to a pre-modern, a 19th century model of Europe from which we escaped at the end of World War II, and I hope we never follow. And that's not to suggest the SNP is in any way anything other than a respectable democratic party, as indeed UKIP does. But I think their rise in Scotland and England, respectively, does speak to a growing popular distrust of the old centrist, liberal, internationalist model of organising Europe, which is reflected across Europe and is I think, a serious threat to the globalisation, international cooperation, democratic norms which have been built up painfully since the 50s and now I think are under more strain than they have been for a very long time for social and economic reasons, but also because of a distrust of well-established elites who seem to offer very few alternatives between left and right. Now, nationalism's not the answer. It wasn't the answer in the 20s and 30s. It's not the answer now. And in a way, I think the structures that were built up after World War II have made it much easier for smaller states to survive and prosper than ever in the past. Being a small state anywhere in the world in the late 19th century wasn't a very comfortable thing to be. But precisely because of the globalization of internationalism, international institutions we built up, certainly in Europe, but actually I think elsewhere, it's possible to be prosperous and secure if you're small. And Scottish nationalists will say, absolutely right, that, well, you say we can't prosper and survive and be secure as a small state. Well, Norway can, Denmark can, Holland can, Belgium can. All these are Scots less capable of running their own affairs than Danes or Irish or Norwegians? And of course the answer is no, of course. In the end, Scotland will be able to make its way in the world with a fair wind, like all those other countries have. And therefore making the argument purely in terms of inability to run their own affairs doesn't wash in Scotland, and I think quite rightly. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be costs involved in separation, or that there are advantages in union which don't accrue from cooperation in organisations like the European Union. Even though the European Union, a lot of things are shared, markets are shared, a lot of regulation is shared. But there are things which, not least in the defence and foreign policy area, the currency area and elsewhere, where it's hard to share if you're distinct sovereign entities, as Trevor described. And again, I think for Scots who believe that in the end Scottish identity is what matters, in the end those questions are perhaps less important. I mean, if you were a Latvian in 1991, then the sort of discussion that we're having today in Scotland would be irrelevant. You wouldn't be asking, well, what's it going to do with our trade and shoes with Russia if we become independent? You would say, well, we will be prepared to bear any price in order to get ourselves free of our traditional oppressor. And that's not the argument in Scotland. The SNP is saying we'll maintain the same head of state, the monarch, which like Canada and Australia did when they became independent. They want to maintain a currency. There's another debate about whether that's feasible or not. I'm sceptical. They want to maintain a social union, an implicit acceptance by the SNP that in very many respects we're the same people. And Scotland has its, historically of course, the difference between the two countries was in part defined by the fact that they had separate churches. Scotland maintained a separate church after the Union, maybe less important than it was then. We still have a separate football league, which probably matters just as much nowadays. But in most respects, the countries are, I think, rather strongly integrated, and economically, of course, also. In the case, if there were to be separation, then there would, I think, undoubtedly be significant shifts of employment patterns and economic patterns. Some industries would fall, like defence, probably finance. Others would rise to take their place, as happens in most market economies. So it would be a period of significant economic disruption. But in economics, as in security, the fate of Scotland, the path Scotland went down, whether they went down a relatively best case, smooth path to independence on the one hand, or a worst case, Irish-style path to independence at the very worst case end of the spectrum, would, I think, depend critically on what was negotiated in the weeks and months after a yes vote, and much of what happened after that, I think, would be quite path-dependent. A lot would depend on whether you were able to get some of the key issues negotiated to the mutual satisfaction of the two governments. And I think it would be very much in the interest of London and Edinburgh for those negotiations to work. But of course, that doesn't mean that they would work. And as Sir Richard absolutely rightly said, one of the key issues in defence here would be the issue of trident basing. My own view, which I expressed in something the Lucy Journal published a couple of weeks ago, is that one possible solution to try and make this a technocratic rather than political issue would be for the two sides to set up a joint feasibility study of the possibilities of relocation, and agreed in principle there would not be relocation except by mutual consent, which would be a hard pill for the Scots for some Scots to swallow. But I think there would be many who'd be thankful to put that issue on the back burner. And I think if the issue of Trident basing was parked, postponed, and put off for another day, then it would, I think, provide a real opportunity for cooperation in other areas of defence. I think Scotland, of course, can establish its own armed forces given time, just as Denmark can on a budget comparable with that of the one proposed by the Scottish Government. But it would take time. Like other small NATO member states, it would be very dependent on assistance from other member states. And the idea that you could create a freestanding Scottish Defence Force in the first couple of years is not feasible. The final remark, if I may, Trevor, two remarks, if I may, is on NATO and the EU. I think it's important, perhaps particularly in the case of the EU, not to assume, and it's possible, but not to assume that Scotland will be treated as if it was joining the end of the queue with Montenegro and Serbia and Bosnia and so on. After all, Scottish territory is at present part of the EU. It's a unique case. Historically, there hasn't been a case like this. East Germany, which is a different set of circumstances. Again, East Germany didn't have to go through a special membership process, even though it wasn't covered by EU regulations before it joined. And I think this would be treated as a special case. Now, that doesn't mean that all the issues of rebate and so on would not have to be sorted out. But I think if the UK went to the EU and said, look, we've decided to split into two states, we want the two states to remain members of the EU at the moment of secession, let's negotiate how to do that, then there would be a fair chance that there would of course be issues of precedent for the Spaniards, but I think there would be strong interest amongst everybody involved to come to some sort of settlement. The one thing I think on the EU that could potentially, one of the things which could potentially make that more difficult is precisely the threat of an EU referendum in 2017. The UK government that emerged after this period of uncertainty and double elections and goodness knows what else was to go to the EU and say we want continuity of membership for Scotland and the UK after separation. But actually we're also going to have a referendum on whether we're going to be in the EU after all. Then Brussels might well say, well, maybe you should sequence these and decide whether you want to be in the EU first before coming to us with a proposition for Scottish continuity, which is probably one more reason amongst many why I think the 2016 independence date, even if there is a yes vote in September, is pretty unrealistic, and we're likely to see that pushed back a couple of years at least. Thanks.
Thank you. I went to Scotland, I think first time in modern times, since this was about 2 years ago, and went to speak in Scotland. And I realised that if you're in British political life, as opposed to academic life, it's very easy. If you try to reduce the impact of Scottish independence for the UK, you will increase the probability. And if you try to reduce the probability, you will increase the impact. Which is one of the reasons why I think that the British political class find it so difficult to talk about some of these issues. Joe, you're on last but not least, you're at London School of Economics.
Yes, thank you very much. I should say that I'm going to speak very briefly about Scottish independence as a constitutional lawyer, as a public lawyer, and I take no view on whether Scotland would be better off as an independent state or worse off, or how it compares to other countries, or the merits or demerits of independence in itself. I leave that for other people to decide. I'm more interested in the impact of independence for public law and and also the conditions of a law, but I won't get too technical. In fact, I think what is striking about the referendum and the debate is that it is based on a platform of stability. And I think this is true for the yes campaign as for the no campaign. They both have coherent answers, right? The SNP's policy program reads a little bit like a wish list, but the no campaign is also defined by supposed certainty as to what Scotland can and cannot have, as we saw in relation to the Osborne-Alexander stance on the currency union, for instance, which they very quickly dismissed even before any negotiations had taken place. So that's what they have in common. But I approach this referendum debate more from a perspective of uncertainty, both domestically and internationally. And it is interesting to hear the synonyms that have already in the last 45 minutes been used. You spoke about secession earlier. You mentioned a sovereign state, that sovereign state should be used and not an independent state. Others, I think you also said that we were assuming Scotland that was separate from the United Kingdom. Well, none of this is necessarily included in the word independence. And so what independence actually is as a word is it's incredibly vague. And its beauty is entirely in the eye of the beholder. So a yes vote in September does not automatically or necessarily, from a legal point of view, mean that Scotland will secede. What it does, and this is where it gets technical, is it kickstarts a process into being, it brings into life the negotiation process, which has already been mentioned, between London, Edinburgh, and I would like to think also Brussels, at some point, but mainly between London and Edinburgh. The list of negotiations, or the topics for negotiation, is familiar. They're familiar and they have already been mentioned, from currency to debt, assets, oil, international treaties, the Queen's head on the stamp, and Strictly Come Dancing, right? So from the important to the trivial, it is all up for negotiation. Again, the outcome of this negotiation is unknown. And it's important that it is unknown, otherwise it wouldn't be a negotiation process between the two respective sides. So, what are the options then? I think we assume, and because we've already mentioned that Scotland would become a sovereign state and separate from the United Kingdom, but it's not clear at all that that is what the SNP actually want, because they're not saying that, and there would be no support in Scotland for it. For as long as I've been looking into Scottish independence, the minute you ask the Scottish people, do you want Scotland to be an independent state, you get a higher proportion of supporters than if you ask an independent and separate state, or an independent state separate from the United Kingdom, when support slumps. So it is clear that the Scottish people want some form of independence, but it is not at all clear that they want to break away from the United Kingdom and have internal border controls and visa requirements to visit their grandparents and all of this stuff. So that's why there is uncertainty there. Now, what are the options then? Well, I think an outcome of the negotiation process could well be that Scotland breaks away. It could also be that Scotland gets what is known as Indy Light or Devo Max, which has also already been mentioned. I think that's definitely, that could even be offered before the referendum, and I think there are some plans in the pipeline, as I took from a Scotsman article from a couple of weeks ago. And I suppose a theoretical outcome would also be to keep the status quo, but if there's a yes vote, then that would not be a satisfactory outcome, because it would put the yes vote in a negative light. Andrew, I really liked Andrew's history of referendums, and it's important to bear in mind that this country doesn't have mandatory referendums. They're not binding, but and this is why I'm not speaking as a lawyer, that doesn't mean that they're irrelevant. They stand for something, but it's not clear what they mean yet. Now, how do we overcome this uncertainty and the unknown outcome of the negotiation process? I know that this is unpopular in Scotland, but the Constitution Unit and myself, 14 years ago now, we proposed a second referendum. I agree with Malcolm that 2 years is probably unrealistic given the nature of the debates, and that the date may well have to be pushed back. I also think that the longer these negotiations take place, the more uncertainty there will be surrounding these negotiations. And I don't think the British public are actually very good at being patient, right? The coalition negotiations. I mean, how long did the coalition negotiations in Belgium last? Years. In Germany, weeks or months. And here, in May 2010, people got nervous after 5 or 6 days and wanted an answer. And it's not going to be that quick. So I think a second referendum where the terms and conditions of the negotiation process are put before the Scottish people in a second referendum, and the answer is, the best we could do is, let's say, Indy Light, as in, we will keep the Queen and we will not be a sovereign entity, but we get a better deal on fisheries, we keep the oil, we would pay a share of the national debt. Don't know what happens to Trident. Some sort of compromise will have to be made, right? But these are all subject to negotiation. It would be a compromise, like in any divorce. And then the people of Scotland say, we're happy with this, or we're not happy with this. I think that is more honest, and that will ultimately give us the certainty which is, for the people actually, which is currently missing and will be missing for the entire duration of the negotiation process. I said that there was also uncertainty in relation to the international dimension. I don't have much to add in relation to, and my views on the European Union are on record. I entirely agree that Scotland meets all the formal conditions and will not have to join the EU behind Montenegro and Serbia and Turkey. Bad example to mention in present company, but of course I think the most likely situation is that Scottish membership would be fast-tracked. It might even be automatic, but not as of right. I think I said earlier that the negotiation process would take place, it would be tripartite between, and would include Brussels, and much of the success of the negotiation process with Brussels will depend on how the negotiations go between London and Edinburgh, and with what attitude Scotland negotiates. So if Scotland says, we want to be a good member state of the EU, not like the rest of the United Kingdom, but we want to be a member of the EU, and we want to sign up to the Schengen Agreement and to the Euro, it's going to go swimmingly. If they start picking their way through the negotiation process exactly like their next door neighbour and say, of course we want to be part of the European Union, but we don't want your euro currency and we don't want to be part of Schengen, well, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to work that way. And any goodwill that comes from the European Union will very quickly evaporate. And that's not even taking into account domestic political concerns, of course, in Spain, in France, in Italy, that all have their own secessionist campaigns or strong regional concerns that would put them on the back foot on the topic of independence. So I think even though internationally in relation to the European Union there are hard and fast rules, I don't think that the negotiation process will be necessarily determined by those hard and fast rules. That too is a process of negotiation. We don't know which rules will apply, which will be fast-tracked, and which will be ignored. The German case has already been mentioned. There can be special accommodation for these kind of situations. We don't know what it's going to be. And so, but again, I would not assume, and this is why I think the SNP is making a strategic mistake, although maybe from their perspective it's a strategic necessity, that everything is going to go according to plan. There is a degree of uncertainty, and I think the only thing we can do as commentators, as observers, is recognize where the uncertainty lies and accommodate that, integrate that into our expectations. But at some point we need to make sure that there is certainty on this outcome. Thank you.
I think a voice of reason. The bit I haven't heard in the discussion is perhaps about the voice of unreason that might appear south of the border in the event of a yes vote. Some people have said the infrastructure is already there. We just need to reinforce it into the form of a bedroom wall. And there are people that would be very hostile to an independent Scotland and would make its life as difficult as possible. And I remember one discussion about the border in Scotland, and someone said, "Oh, we don't think that we'll have an open border." And I gently said, "It's not up to you." And that's one of the perspectives we haven't heard today, just to bring it in. But I think it's a real consideration. Right, let's take some questions. So.
I think my question actually both for Malcolm and for Joe as well, both of them. I think German example is not a good example because German example is marriage. UK, Scotland is going to get divorced. One is register office, other one is court. There are different places, different issues there. For that reason, German case cannot be actually for Scotland. And I don't know if Scotland can be maybe end of the European Union as well, because Brussels itself cannot bring together it, because there was a separation in Belgium itself as well. And Spain is a conflict. France, there is a Corsica problems, many other issues as well. I think Scotland is not going to be, maybe can stay behind the Turkey as well. Turkey started with members since 1963 and still on the queue.
They're moving back in the queue.
I think there's a slightly different question about where in the line it would be. There's a slightly different question about who outside Scotland thinks that a yes vote would be good for Europe, as it were.
No one. But just on your point about Germany, I think you're absolutely right, and I have written about that as well. And really, the point is the following: it's not like this. If Scotland became independent, whatever that means, it would be unprecedented. If it was in a position in which it had to reapply to join the EU, that would be unprecedented. That has not happened. And there's the Greenland case, and that's not a good precedent. And the Germany case, as you say, it's kind of the reversal. And how was that accommodated? The reason that German reunification was not a problem. I mean, it was a political problem for Mrs. Thatcher at the time. But the reason it wasn't a problem legally is because nothing changed in the treaty. The German constitution was expanded to cover East Germany, but Germany did not gain in votes in the council. It did not have more representatives in the European Parliament. And so from a European perspective, nothing changed. Germany remained exactly the same size in terms of voting rights as France. That changed later, but not with the Maastricht Treaty. It changed afterwards. But Nice was the first time Nice. That's right. Nice. That's right. So Nice was when the weighted voting rights were looked at again, but that was 2001. The same cannot be said for Scotland, as you rightly say, because Scotland would have to be accommodated somehow,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all right. In the German case, I think we both brought it up only to say that the EU doesn't have one way of handling membership. It's a more flexible organisation than the international lawyers sometimes make out.
And the Scottish case would be unique. There is no precedent for it. You could also talk about Greenland's status if you really want to get nerdy about this. I think you have to, in the end, think about the political reality of the scenario you're talking about. And if you have a scenario in which before independence, before separation, the UK government goes to Brussels as and let's assume it's still committed to remaining in the EU, because otherwise all bets would be off. But if everybody's confident the UK wants to remain a member of the EU and said, look, we have this problem about how to get smooth transition, we're going to negotiate with you in good faith to make it happen, then I think that the vast majority of countries in the European Union would say, yes, we want to make that happen. Now, I think there would be a problem with countries facing their own separatist movements, in particular Spain in relation to Catalonia. If the situation in Catalonia is develops as it appears to be developing, absolutely. And I think they would, almost certainly there would have to be some sort of side deal with the Spanish to make it clear that in no way does this create a precedent for separatist states joining without the permission of their EU member state. But the UK would be distinct because it would be not Scotland applying to become an EU member, but the UK applying to become 2 members rather than 1, which I think is an important distinction. So I think that this will be high politics, there will be a lot of bargaining. That's why I think the issue of the UK's overall status in the EU would be absolutely central to the discussion of Scottish membership. And actually, the last point I would make, I'm not sure I agree with Joe entirely that there's no way in which Scotland can become a member and retain its current status in relation to the Eurozone and Schengen. Again, that would be part of the negotiation, but I think it's possible, since Scotland would be a special case, that the UK could answer, well, what we want is to remain as we are, with Scotland not in the Eurozone and not in Schengen. In practical terms, it would be absurd, it would be in nobody's interest to have a border across Hadrian's Wall. But of course, your point earlier is also absolutely right. That if Scotland wants a common travel area, it has to have a common migration policy.
Chairman, I mean, your point a couple of minutes ago, it's not up to you. It seems to me crucial, really, because independence is a very clear term, I think, contrary to what's been said. It's not, as Andrew implied, it's on a continuum for Devo Max, but it isn't, because it means you're not sending MPs to Westminster, and you have no representation in the Cabinet. I mean, the Quebecois tried to finagle that question when they said their referendum was on sovereignty association, and they didn't want separation. But when you asked whether they were going to continue to send MPs to Ottawa, they said, after all, humming and hawing, no. And this is crucial because it means that Scotland loses leverage and has to negotiate for things that she now has as of right. And it's interesting, if one looks at the Irish precedent, the first measure that affected Ireland that came up after the Sinn Féin MPs declined to take their seats in 1980 was the Government of Ireland Act, partitioning the country. And it's arguable the position of the Northern Catholics would have been much better if they'd had Southern Catholics there to argue for them. And this is a very key point, and it shouldn't be seen as just a point on a continuum, the question of whether you're sending MPs to Westminster or not. And that means that the SNP's proposals are a wish list, and they may get them, but that's up to the goodwill of the rest of the United Kingdom. It could be in short supply. So they're aspirations and can't be any more. The second point I want to make is a question to Joe when he said that the referendum isn't binding. And my understanding is that Parliament will not have a chance to consider it again, that a yes vote is a yes vote and that's final, just as with the alternative referendum and the referendum of Welsh primary legislation. These are not advisory referendums, but binding ones. And the question I want to ask you, is it binding? Is it also legally binding? And suppose you've had I'm going to take extreme example, you're a 20% turnout, and very, very narrow majority yes. Parliament said, the House of Commons, and I don't believe it would, if part of the House of Commons said, we're going to ignore that, is it legally, is the outcome of this referendum legally binding on Parliament? It doesn't come back to Parliament, as I understand.
That's a good question. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Well,
No, you go first.
Okay. My understanding is, well, I'd have to look at actually the precise terms of the Edinburgh Agreement again, where this was decided. But my understanding is that it would not be legally binding, but I don't think it could be I think your alternative of ignoring it would not be viable either. So it has this political currency. But what would be binding about it? I mean, I just don't understand how you could hold anyone, how the Scots could say, well, but we have voted for yes on independence when, and I fully agree with you. My understanding of the word independence is also that Scotland would separate. But no one has said that. No, that has not been made express, and it's not inherent in the independence is not is a term of art. It's not a technical term of law, and so that's not clear. And so what if the outcome of the negotiation was, and after 2 years that Devo Max, for argument's sake, was what was on the table? Could someone then judicially review the outcome and say, well, this is not what we meant by independence? The United Kingdom Constitution hasn't historically operated in that way. It's not the Constitution isn't litigated, and so I would say that it's not legally binding, but that doesn't mean to say that it's also not worth the paper.
It's clearly morally binding.
Well,
politically
yes.
binding, as all previous referenda. One in 1975 was advisory, that's clear, but obviously morally binding. But I mean, you could imagine all sorts of odd results where Parliament might say, well, wait a minute. Suppose it was regionally very skewed, and lots of regions of Scotland said we don't want this. Will Parliament look at it again? Are they legally bound to implement the result?
Parliament would have to take further action because, in my opinion, because it would require a repeal of the Acts of Union, and that then raises a further long-running argument between constitutional lawyers as to whether Parliament can repeal the Act of Union, because the Act of Union creates Parliament. And it also states that I think the exact words are, it remains in force forever after.
Like the Irish Church Act, which was repealed.
Yeah, so probably my guess is that if the political will's there, you could repeal the Act of Union, but you're also almost certainly, in my view, going to get litigation from somebody who feels that they've lost out commercially or economically through independence, and they will challenge the power of Parliament. So I would have thought there may be constitutional lawyers in the room, but it will almost certainly end up in the courts. In the end, the courts will be very frightened to try and overall say that the result of a referendum can't be acted upon by Parliament. But it does. I think it has to come back to Parliament because they have to repeal the Act of Union. And the SNP have argued in the past that the Scotland Act 1998, which allows the transfer of powers using secondary legislation, could be used to transfer everything to the Scottish Parliament. They've said that legally could be done, but that's not the way they'd like it to be done. They've argued that could be done in a previous white paper issue, but I think it does have to go back to Parliament. And what if Parliament wouldn't vote for it? I mean, the MPs like to rebel, don't they? I haven't heard a proper discussion of that in any public.
Technically, Scottish independence would be a grant from the Westminster Parliament, right? And so
From Westminster.
yeah.
The only point I'd add to that, the only point I wanted to add to that discussion of the role of the Westminster Parliament is the role of the Scottish Parliament, because one of the reasons why the SNP want independence to take place at the same time as the Scottish election in May, I think it is 2016, is because if you had a scenario in which independence didn't take place until the Scottish Parliament election, then there would be an all-Scotland vote on the election to the Scottish Parliament in May 16, once the negotiations have been running for a year and a half, in which effectively the Scottish people would have the opportunity to elect people who were not supportive of separation. And although it wouldn't be a second referendum, it would be a second just as legitimate vote in which the SNP lost the majority. Then all bets were off, and it was quite a remarkable achievement for the SNP to get a majority in the first place. So I think, effectively, I think the SNP, for technical reasons, would find it very difficult to complete everything by early 2016. Any sign the opinion polls were showing buyers' regret, and the government in London would have a big incentive to spin out the negotiations until after the Scottish election.
Yes, Sebastian Payne. I agree with Joe. I don't think it is in the scenario that Professor Bolton refers to, where there's low turnout and it's regionally skewed. I don't think there is any mechanism as such that makes it legally binding. And Andrew refers to going back to Parliament, but that's what the courts would say, it's for Parliament. In the political system. I mean, if Parliament passes an act, then it's legally binding. But the common law, there's no I mean, just because it's judicially reviewed, doesn't mean that the courts will say it's not justiciable. This is a core political decision. So I'm entirely with Joe's analysis.
Hi, Steve Pearce from the University of Essex. A couple of, first of all, a couple of scenarios that I think are interesting. One scenario is that the no vote wins narrowly, like 52, 55%. We then have a referendum which results 2 years later, 3 years later, in leaving the EU. That might be an opportunity, of course, for the SNP to say, well, hold on, this is our renewed opportunity to argue for an independent Scotland. This is our reason for a second referendum to try again, because the Scottish people want to stay in the EU. You can easily imagine a scenario of the vote to leave the EU being narrowly in favour of leaving, with, let's say, 60% of Scots voting to stay in, and 55% of the English voting to leave, in which case that would be the SNP's argument. There's another sort of awkward scenario if there's a yes vote in Scotland. We have a very awkward scenario in terms of preparing a 2017 referendum, because then the 2017 referendum becomes more likely and the vote to leave the EU becomes more likely, because you take those 59 MPs out of Parliament, only one of them is a Tory at the moment, and it's unlikely to move this large next year. So you have a much more likely scenario of a Conservative majority or a largest party, if it doesn't happen anyway, which would therefore be in a position to legislate for the 2017 referendum. And of course, without the Scottish votes, you have a bigger possibility of the no side winning. But then you also have this complication, if there's a yes vote, of the UK having to argue for two things simultaneously. And I wouldn't describe it as the UK applying to have to be two member states, because it would always retain its status as a member state of the remaining United Kingdom. That couldn't itself, only the maddest Scottish nationalists would say the UK ceases to exist. So the UK would still be there as a member, but we'd have to ask for two things. One thing which would be presumably in the UK's own interests, to maintain our trading links with Scotland, but we would want Scotland to enter as soon as possible as a full member of the European Union. We're the biggest trading partner. It's in our interest, as Mel is in theirs, more in there, still fairly substantially in ours. But we'd be under the scenario of having much more likely to have a Conservative majority government, possibly after a more transition period between the general election and independence. It would also be asking to renegotiate our membership in the European Union. And those are two, I mean, some people have already pointed out, they're sort of rather contradictory things to be asking for at the same time. Yeah. And the interaction between them is very peculiar, I think, and bemuses many other member states.
Maybe they could bring the EU referendum forward.
Possibly, but then they need time to negotiate. I mean, it depends how much they need to negotiate. I think it's correct to say you don't need a treaty amendment for almost anything. You could have a short declaration of a European Council decision and hold a vote on that. And whenever opinion polls ask the question, would you vote to stay in the EU if membership were renegotiated, you have a 2-to-1 majority in favour of staying in, which is exactly the scenario that happened in 1975. Again, without a treaty amendment, we renegotiated our position, successfully won a referendum. So, that's a possible scenario, and perhaps you'd have to wait for what the rest of the EU wanted to do. The crucial question is, I think, what the rest of the EU is willing to do. The UK presumably will agree with Scotland that we don't want them to join the single currency, we don't want them to have join Schengen. So we're with them on that, but the legal framework is open. There has to be an agreement for Scotland to join a member state, to become a member state. The legal framework is open politically as to whether or not Scotland gets opt-out or not. It's open to other member states to, amend the treaties, because the accession agreement is always an amendment to the treaties. Open for them to amend the treaties to say Scotland is another country like the UK that doesn't have to do the single currency. It's another country which has the Justice and Home Affairs opt-out. It's another country we add to the Charter of Rights Protocol, not actually an opt-out. But we can add it, so we do all those things if they want to. Or they could say, no, we're going to renegotiate, we're going to insist on Scotland being in a different position. It's up to them. Of course, it's up to them whether they want to allow Scotland at all. And there's a kind of, in the event of a Tory majority government, of course, these two sets of demands could be traded off against each other. And the member states could start saying, well, let Scotland in if you ask for less in terms of the UK. And then, the Tory majority government is in an awkward position of having to balance its interests in trade with Scotland against its desire to win the referendum, and the backbenchers snapping at David Cameron's heels. I mean, the Tory speaker, I think, was correct in saying David Cameron wants to renegotiate. But it's not correct to say that all of the backbenchers of the Tory party want to renegotiate. Of course, there's a significant number of them that want to leave. And the Tory party comes in third, gets 25%, 20% in the European Parliament elections. UKIP comes in first with this kind of scenarios. You can imagine that kind of pressure growing. So I think these are the kinds of political and legal scenarios that would end up being closely connected to each other, and hard to predict the dynamics of what would happen if there in any of those scenarios.
Two questions. So we take them as points in order, take the two, and then get the response.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Richard Reeve from Oxford Research Group. To return to defence and foreign policy, given what's happened in Ukraine in the last couple of months and the range of forces interested in reinvigorating NATO this year, and the Russian threat at the core of that again, is it remotely credible that NATO would not see Scotland automatically staying within NATO, given that it controls the sea, subsea, and airspace, and a absolutely critical sector of the North Atlantic from that perspective? And secondly, just picking up on Andrew's point about British Empire being a sort of joint opportunity that England and Scotland engaged in. More recently, British sort of neo-imperialism or interventionism has been a joint liability from the Scots perspective, and a particularly weighted liability from the Scots perspective because of the number of Scots regiments. I wonder how the panel see that aspect of British foreign policy, UK foreign policy, having impacted on the referendum. And just a final point on Professor Longmore's point on sovereignty association in the Canadian context. Perhaps one could argue that any independence within the Commonwealth under the British Crown is a kind of sovereignty association, Privy Council and so on. The Commonwealth has always fudged independence or sovereignty, in my opinion. Perhaps this is the latest case of it.
Could I sort of lower the tone a bit and come back to emotion? I think we underestimate the role, the importance of emotion in this debate. And I speak as the soon-to-become ex-father-in-law, or someone whose son-in-law is about to become and he's Scottish, and I'm a Welsh wife. The fact is that this is wonderful, and we enjoy discussing it in this way, but ultimately the ordinary people, much of this is going to bore them to tears in the end, and they will vote on emotion. They will vote on emotion in exactly the same way that Iceland recently said we're going to pull out of the EU, that Norway said no, we're not going to join the EU, and I suspect if you were to ask the Greeks to vote tomorrow about the EU, they will vote entirely on emotion to come out of it. So I think that it is something that we need to address quite seriously. How we do it, I'm not absolutely certain. The other thing, just to bring it a little closer home to involve Turkey, if I may, the Turks, incidentally, I think they will join shortly after North Korea, but that's another matter. What impact on countries like the Turks, in the event of a Scottish referendum saying yes and a successful process that leads to Scottish independence within the EU, how might that impact on thinking in Ankara or indeed further east, and looking at the Kurdish question, what impact that might have on that, and indeed on the way Turkey perceives EU? And I've mentioned Spain, as others have. but a country like Turkey that aspires to become a member that actually has significant lessons there for it within the whole Scottish debate.
Okay, shall we just, it's 3:30, I think we were promised a bit more tea if we wanted afterwards, so we could continue the discussion offline. I'd just like to give each member of the panel a chance to have any final comments and responses to what we've just heard about. So we're going to reverse order and start with you.
Sure, but I'll only say something very briefly about passion, and I think it is there, and it's difficult for, certainly for me as a non-Scot and outsider, and especially lawyer, to comment on something like passion. But I'm not sure if the debate is boring. I think it's actually quite divisive, right, in Scotland, and you have families that are divided on the issue of yes and no and pros and cons of independence. And from what I've heard from my contacts in Scotland, they've been debating nothing else for the past year. And so what I don't think the Scots have is, that was the point of my talk, is sufficient information in which to make an informed decision. And if I was a Scot, I would have absolutely no idea how to vote in September. If I want a better deal for Scotland but not secession, do I vote yes or no? I have no idea.
Welcome. I mean, I agree emotion is a very big part of this, but I remember I asked my aunt a couple of weeks ago how she was going to vote in the referendum. She lives in Glasgow, and she says, well, independence would be a great thing, but what currency would we use? I'm going to vote no. So Scotland is one of the homes of the Enlightenment. It's got a lot of very rational people who do the sums. And they do think about these rather technocratic and boring things, and maybe people in London aren't thinking about currency options, but a lot of people in Scotland actually are. And it's a well-educated society. A lot of people who think about the practicalities of whether they want to go through all this turmoil to get something that ideally they'd like if there was no pain. But there will be pain, and therefore I think that will, in the end, in my view, probably swing the day, but it may not. It's obviously very close. I agree. Yeah. On NATO, I think interventionism over the last decade has made the argument superficially more attractive that Scotland can pursue a very different foreign policy, a more Scandinavian, softer foreign policy than the UK has done. So the argument that you can be at the table and part of the discussion about how we manage Helmand is not really appealing very much in Scotland. But at the end of the day, I think Scotland, we live in a very uncertain world. This is not a vote for the next 5 or 10 years, it's a vote for the next century or more. And I think what events in Ukraine, the South China Sea today remind us of, that things happen. And the argument, in my view, for remaining in NATO for independent Scotland would actually be a very strong one. But I think NATO would want Scotland to be member for the reasons that you give in terms of infrastructure and access to the North Atlantic and so on. But I think the condition for Scottish membership in NATO would be, first of all, agreement between London and Edinburgh on the parameters of post-independence defence. What NATO or the European Union would not want to do is have another Cyprus, where the European Union admitted Cyprus to membership, hoping that membership would encourage them to solve their problems. And it didn't. If anything, it made them more complacent. And therefore, I think that other EU member states would say, you've got to sort all this out between you, and then, of course, you can come. And right at the top of that list of defence things to sort out would be the issue of Trident Basin. The reason why Scotland will have to do a deal on Trident Basin is not because NATO will object. It's because the UK will object to being forced to become a non-nuclear state. Not because of its own decision, but because of Scottish independence. And UK may one day decide to go non-nuclear of its own volition, but it would be humiliating in the extreme to force that in the UK as a result of a referendum. But if Scotland does a deal on Trident Basin, then I think it would have a pretty clear route to NATO membership.
On war making, joint liability of Scotland being belonging to wars, yes, I think that there has been a powerful message that comes out that being part of the UK drew us into the Iraq War, for example, gets put out there. And it's interesting to note that one of the reasons the Act of Union was forced through in the first place in the early 18th century was because the Scottish Estates, their Parliament, had passed an act giving them control over the royal prerogative right to declare wars, and there was a real fear that they might use that power to not get involved in a war against France, so that had to be dealt with. So there's a kind of symmetry there. And I think, I'd add, I think Vernon's right to say there's a very important formal distinction between whether or not you're actually sending MPs to the UK Parliament. That's clearly, you've crossed a very important line, and if Scotland aren't doing that anymore, then something has changed formally that's very important. On the other hand, there probably would be bodies akin to the Council of the Isles as we have now, I should imagine, being created in place that might turn out to be more serious than the Council of the Isles as actual negotiating forms. So in that sense, we'd be getting a kind of confederal arrangement, which is what I had in mind. But yeah, I don't think the term continuum would be right. I think there's definitely an important formal distinction, but there'd have to be some kind of coordinating bodies. If the SNP got it, particularly if the SNP got everything on its wish list, because how else would all these shared policies actually be coordinated?
Well, thank you. I'd like to, I'm sure before we thank four speakers, one in his absence. There's a neglected issue which we haven't addressed, which is what would the new disunited kingdom be called? It occurs to me that if you read a German newspaper, the Königin is always Queen Elizabeth, so perhaps you will just become the kingdom. But what would the new UK be called? A major takeaway that I have from this discussion is that the legal profession is probably praying for a yes vote. Because I can see the cash flow already. And my colleague, my Scottish colleague at work said, apropos the emotion point, he said, he is Scottish, a bit like yourself, and he said the Scottish people will talk with their hearts and vote with their wallets, which may take us down the line that you're suggesting. I think that the last point, though, is that if we did get a yes vote, I think the adjective was used quite early on, it would be a seismic event, not just in the UK, but perhaps in wider Europe as well. Well, thank everybody for their contribution, thank you for the organisers, and everybody particularly for being so timely in their talks. Thank you. Now, if you want to advertise your next meeting,
yeah, by all means. Again, next week, Wednesday, at the start of the earlier time, 12:30, we've got another event similar to this, a roundtable discussion on the Scottish referendum. This time it will just concentrate on the EU and economic implications of independent Scotland. Our keynote speakers will be Professor John Kay from the LSE, University of Oxford and Financial Times, got a lot of affiliations. We've got Professor Robert Hazel from the Constitution Unit at UCL. And we'll have Dr. Monique Ebel from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and we'll also have Professor Panos Koutrakos from the City Law School University, the City University at London. So again, you're all invited if you'd like to attend. And the chair will be Professor Philip Booth as well from the Institute of Economic Affairs. That's it. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll come along. That's your real